Welcome to MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 569. This program is in loving memory of Miriam Bas Eliyahu Altes, Allah Hashalom, and the merit of Baruch ben Yamin ben Menucha Lana Altes, Yukasil ben Leah Rachel and Rachel Bas Liba Farkash, dedicated by Pinchas Todres ben Miriam and Sarah Bas Rachel Altes. So we are in the early days of the month of Kislev, and called in Hasidic language, the Chodesh HaGeulah. Obviously, firstly, the geulah of Yutas Kislev of the Alter Rebbe later in the month. Chanukah, of course, is also a geulah from what the events that happened back then. We have the Chag HaGeulah of the Mitteler Rebbe on Yud Kislev, and we have the geulah of the Rebbe in Tafshin Lamed Ches, when he came home on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, when he went home for the first time from his room after the heart attack, Hashmini Atzeres. And therefore the month is a month of redemption in so many different ways. The Rebbe's father, Rabbi Jacobson, talks about the month of Kislev as being the third month from Tishrei, similar to the third month of Sivan, which is the third month after Nisan. And as such, the month is filled with all kinds of power and energy, relevant to us Chassidus Applied, the energy of geulah. We all can use geulah both on a personal level, on a psychological level, on an emotional level, and of course on a spiritual level, and above all, geulah amitis v'ashleim on a collective level. So may this month be indeed the geulah in all those levels, on a personal, all the way to the geulah klalis of Klal Yisrael, of the entire world from Golus. So, as we always do, we live with the times, look at the month. We also look at the parsha that we read in this week's, to live with the times, leb mit der Zeit. So we are in parsha Vayeitzei, beginning of parsha Vayeitzei. Let's talk about Vayeitzei. We'll talk about Tes Kislev, which is at the end of this week, next Shabbos, and some other interesting questions that keep coming in, which again I thank you for. ChassidusApplied.com is our website where you can go and submit any question, completely anonymous and confidential. Nothing is taboo, nothing is off limits, all questions are accepted. Because there's so many questions, so we have a backup. That's the only qualification. However, I try to cover topic by topic, week after week. And it's now, we're going into 13 years since MyLife Chassidus Applied began. Literally thousands, tens of thousands of questions that have come in, probably hundreds of thousands of questions to be honest, but tens for sure of thousands that have been answered. So you go to ChassidusApplied.com and find the archives of all previous programs. You can search by word, today with using our AI tools, which are readily available. Also on WhatsApp, we have a WhatsApp AI at work where people are using it now quite steadily. So please take advantage of that. You go to simonjacobson.ai, it'll take you to the WhatsApp, where you can just type in any question and it will access the inventory of all the archives, of all the material, not just Chassidus Applied, but in general, that we have accumulated over the years, the books, writings, articles, videos, audio, you name it. Try it out. And love to hear your feedback and thoughts. As always, it's a work in progress, and with your help, can only improve it. So, with that said, as I said, the lesson of Kislev in general, a lesson of light over darkness, the story of Chanukah, the lesson of geulah from all different challenges, and namely, since we're talking about Chassidus, connected to the revelation of Chassidus, Yutas Kislev, Yud Kislev, and the other special days of this month. So the parsha Vayeitzei, interestingly, parallels that as well. Vayetzei Yaakov and Leah, and Vayelech Harana, that's how the parsha begins. And you could say, 1 second, that's the opposite of geulah. Yaakov is leaving Be'er-Sheva, the home of his parents in Eretz Yisrael, and going Harana. Be'er-Sheva is the fountain of seven, as Chassidus explains, going with the 7 midas of Atzilus, is going from there into Harana. Harana is Charein Afshel Mokim, the divine wrath. And as the Eira Chaim explains, it actually reflects the Yeridas and Neshama Beguf, the descent of every soul into a body. Yaakov representing every neshama, And the very name Yaakov, Vayetzei Yaakov, is Yud Akev, the Yud of Hashem of Hashem, the name of God. Akev, going down into the Akev, to the heel. The lowest level, that the Avos Rab Nosson calls Malach HaMovesh Sheba Adam. In every human being, we encompass all the entire world. Elam Katan Zeh Adam, a human being is a universe, a microcosm. And the Akev, which is the most insensitive spot in the body, that's why it can absorb the shock when you walk on the ground, because it has the least amount of sensitive nerves, is the Malach HaMovesh Sheba Adam. It's called like the angel of death within the person, because of its lack of sensation. And that's where the neshama comes down. So Yaakov's going away from Beersheba to Haran represents that. But the whole purpose of that is not to remain there. It's to build his family, as we learn later in the chapter. But then to come back, the Yaakov Holach Ladarki, the end of the chapter, talks about Yaakov returning, this time laden with entire family and all the blessings that he achieved. Yes, he went through a very difficult time there. So just like it is with every geulah means that there was a golus before the geulah. So in many ways, Vayeitzei is the story of both golus and geulah in each one of our lives. So that's the first, what lessons do we learn from living with the times with this week's Torah parsha? We look to find the story of the parsha in our own personal lives. And that's what you need to do, is to apply it. Ask yourself, find an example in your life when there was a Vayetzei Yaakov, where your neshama traveled from one place, a brighter place, to a darker place. And it can take on many different ways. It can be a physical journey, it can be a spiritual journey, a psychological one. But we all go through it. And it's dafka that journey that helps us build our families. As we'll learn a few verses later, when Hashem appears to Yaakov in the dream and tells him, not only don't be afraid of entering in this darker world, but know that this is the place where you'll be blessed. And he continues, V'shavti v'shalom, you'll return in peace. And you'll come back, your children will be like the dust of the earth, meaning so plentiful, spread all over. Chassidus explains offers from the world bittul, not in a negative way, in a positive way. A humble people, which is the secret of their eternity. And they will spread for us the yom of Akeme, east, west, north, south, Safena v'Negba. Ultimate blessing, to blossom, to flourish. The story of the Jewish people. But it all begins, Yaakov running away from Esau, running to Haran to go find his wife and build his family. And that's the story of our lives. So we take that strength from Yaakov. Every detail and every nuance is relevant. We're not going to go through all of them. We'll just cover some basic ones. And keep in mind that I've also discussed it in previous years. Every year, Parsha Vayeitzei. So you can look more material, chassidusapplied.com, for previous years of this week's parsha. So we'll begin after the general theme. What is represented by Jacob's ladder and the angels ascending and descending? Jacob's ladder. So a ladder in general is the sign of a bridge between two worlds. Sulam mutzav artza, the pasuk says. The ladder that stood on the ground, v'reishe magia hashamayma, and the top of the ladder reached into heaven. That's exactly why we come down below, to create a bridge, an interface, a mamutza, between heaven and earth. So the ladder itself represents this bridge. And as a ladder has rungs, you don't have to jump many steps. It's a step-by-step process, stepping stones. The whole Seder Ishtalshlus is about creating a bridge between the divine and existence. In Svarim it speaks about that the Sulam represents tefillah, prayer. And prayer is exactly that type of bridge. When we daven, down below, we're connecting and creating a ladder. And the ladder has 4 rungs. So in Nevuchim and in other places, and the Agachover explains it, the 4 rungs represent the 4 stages in davening. Every tefillah shachris and morning davening has 4 stages. Different ways it's explained. Generally, Birchas HaShachar, Psuke de Zimra, Krishma, and Shemoneh Esrei. Sometimes explained Birchas HaShachar, Psuke de Zimra, Birchas Krishma, and Krishma. And Shemoneh Esrei is another level. They correspond to the 4 worlds. Asiya, Yitzira, Bria, and Atzilus. It's a journey. Tefillah is a journey. Famous story with the Maggid. One of his chavedim, when they were young, and they learned together Kabbalah, Primus HaTeira, came to visit him, to Mezrich. After davening, he sees everybody finish davening, including him. The Maggid is continuing to daven. So he thought a few minutes, no, a long time, Avedas HaTefillah. But he's waiting for his old friend, so to speak. They haven't seen each other. Finally, the Maggid finishes davening. He meets him. Shalom Aleichem. We're going to go. Let's have something to eat together. So right away, the Chaver says to the Maggid, he says, we learned together Kabbalah and all the Kavonas HaTefillah, all their intentions. And, davening, okay, half hour, an hour, whatever. How is it that you're davening so long? So the Maggid asks him, what do you do for parnasa? So he said, a few times a year I go to Leipzig, the marketplace, spend time there, buy material, bring it home, and my family resells it for somewhat of a small profit, so we have some parnasa. So the Maggid says to him, and how long does it take you to travel there? He says, a long time. So to go first traveling, pack up and travel, then stay, buy scheda, bring it back. So it's a journey, it's a while. So the Maggid says, why do you have to do all that traveling? Why not just stay home, close your eyes, and contemplate how you're going to Leipzig, how you're buying the material, how you bring it back, and how you're making profit from it. Maggid, says the Chaver, his old Chaver, he says to him, "Zet a batler." Because we need the scheda, we need the material. Contemplation is not going to help. And the Maggid smiled and said to him exactly the same thing. When you travel, going the journey of tefillah, you want the scheda, it takes time. It's not just contemplating on it. I remember when the Rebbe told the story in such a detail. It was Shabbos Bereshis Tafshin Mem Aleph. That year Simchas Torah was on Friday, so the 2 Farbrengens Mem Aleph. The first Farbrengen, the Rebbe told the story. But the whole geschmack and the detail of it. You could feel like you were on a journey. So the journey on the ladder. Yaakov's journey and now the journey of the ladder. And it is a journey. And when you look at it that way, your life becomes so enriched and elevated. Everything you're doing is elevating the world onto a ladder, connecting it to heaven, but earth connected to heaven. And what are the angels going up and down? So for every tefillah we make, it's an aliyah. We create angels. And the angels are Eila L'mayla. But we're also mamshich. Tefillah is not just Allah, it also draws down. We ask for things, bakoshes tzrochav, we ask for our needs, and we're mamshich. So the angels represent the shluchim. Shluchei hamokim, the Eibishter's messengers and agents and ambassadors, those that we create, initiate, and those that come down from above. Someone asked the question, if the ladder in Yaakov's dream represents prayer, why were the angels traveling up and down? Since prayer is something we initiate from below to above, wouldn't the angels carrying and delivering the prayer only be traveling from below to above? The answer is no. It's a two-way journey. Halah and Hamshacha. In Ayin Beis, where he talks at length about the difference between Tefillah and Torah, Tefillah being mamat l'mayla and Torah mamayla l'mat, arimim chelekaya melech, the two interpretations. So he talks about this. That even the halacha of tefillah also has hamshacha, and even the hamshacha of Torah also has halacha, because you need the full fusion, the full joining, the quality of each. Mamata l'mayla is more on our terms. Mamayla l'mata is more from the divine, meaning on the terms of above. And you want the joining and the fusion of both. He actually discusses there, B'chlal the malachim, it's a chelik gimel ayin beis. Malachim represent the cosmic digestive system, who process the hamshachas, both that come from top down and from bottom up. Okay. The next question. Why was there a need for God to make a promise to Jacob when he had already promised the same thing to Abraham, as we know? Promised as Yisrael, promised that his children would multiply. Someone put it different words a bit. Why, when Yaakov dreamed of the ladder, did Hashem promise him his descendants would inherit this land? If Hashem already made such a promise to Avram, was there something new in this promise to Yaakov that wasn't included in the promise to Avram? And the answer is yes. The Farshim talk about it, the commentaries. So firstly, even reaffirming exactly the same promise also has tremendous value. Because we know we have challenges, and reaffirming is like, not because, God forbid, there's a question the first time God promised it, but it's a reaffirmation. That's number one. Number two, reaffirming it to the different ovis, Avram and Yitzchak and Yaakov. Why we say Elokim Avram, Elokim Yitzchak, Elokim Yaakov? Because each one heard the blessings and heard these promises through their lens. A little more al chassidus, Avram chesed, Yitzchak gevurah, pachad Yitzchak, Yaakov ashapadas Avram tiferes, rachamim. So the bracha is coming on all channels. But in addition to that, the mefarshim, the commentaries point out that you actually see a few things that are added in the Haftach and the promise to Yaakov. First of all, that he would have the divine presence with him all the time. When he says, I am with you, and I will guard you wherever you go. So he says Hashem's personal and continuous presence and protection. Two, that he's guaranteed that he will return. Shafti b'shalom. I'll bring you back to this land. Specific guarantee that I'll return you from the Golus. Not just that you'll inherit the land from Avram. And finally, unwavering commitment. That this would be under all circumstances. Now, of course, you could derive that also from the previous promises, but here it's stated very explicitly. And indeed, Yaakov suffers a lot more than Avram and Yitzchak, even though both of them had their challenges. 20 years with Laban. And like later Yaakov tells Pari that he lived a short and painful life. 147 years compared to Avram's 175 and Yitzchak's 180. So dealing with Esau and then Laban and then the Koftzah Shel Rugzei Shel Yosef, his son Yosef. So Hashem gives him these additional blessings, and of course, Ma'aseh is similar bonim, he's giving it to us. We're receiving it through Yaakov to us. Okay. Next question. How could Yaakov be fooled by Laban when he knew the entire Torah? So he knew what's going to come next. Famous story they tell about Yosef every year. The joke goes, I think it was the Yisrael Ruzhin, I'm not sure. Now Yosef already last year knew that when he went out to find his brothers, they would kidnap him and they almost killed him. So why is he going again? So you could ask a similar question on Yaakov. Yaakov knew kol ha-Torah kula. The Torah says this whole parsha with Laban. So how was he fooled by him? He was able to replace Leah, Rachel. He was able to replace Rachel with Leah. If the patriarchs knew and kept the entire Torah even before it was given at Mount Sinai, how was Yaakov able to be fooled by Laban, who switched Rachel and Leah? Wouldn't Yaakov have known that Laban was going to trick him? If Yaakov read the story in the parsha, but Yaakov still went ahead with it and walked down the aisle with Leah. Okay. So the same question can be asked, obviously, about everything. They knew kol ha'teira kula. Why is Yaakov going down to Mitzrayim? Doesn't know that ultimately they're going to be enslaved. So I understand he had to save them. There was a famine. So firstly, when we say that they knew kol ha'teira kula, we're not told exactly what means they knew. The Ruchni is for sure they knew. Yetzias Mitzrayim existed before Yetzias Mitzrayim happened. The concept of going out of Mitzrayim v'gvulim. Every story in the Torah medaberes b'elyenim and meramezes b'tachtenim. So Baruchni spiritually, absolutely they know it. The Eibishter talk about Isa bar Alma. The Zohar even asked the question, how could you talk about Ish Adam ki yomas ba'oyel, a person dies, when death only comes after Chet Tzadas? And yet, you find death, that means it was predestined that they would have to eat from Eitz Adas. And the Zohar answers, MyLife Chassidus in Eratera Chukas, the famous Maimon Chukas in Ateres from the Rebbe Rashab, explains briefly, just to give the taste of it, that death would have meant something else had they not eaten from the tree of knowledge. So it was not predestined. The same thing here. His engagement with Laban and the whole parsha with Leah and Rachel and everything else that happened was going to happen one way or another. But it could have been a spiritual way and wouldn't have to go through the Agmas Nefesh. Because, as we can understand, the story of the exchange was not just that Laban was trying to fool him, but there has to be a deeper reason. Because from Leah and Rachel, and then Bilhah and Zilpah came out, the Shvatim, and it had to be this dafka in this manner, and it had to be dafka through deception. But it could have happened many different ways. Yaakov, even if he knew it all, he knew it had to happen a certain way. Did he know it was going to happen exactly this way? Not necessarily. He wouldn't obviously agreed. But you clearly know from the whole parsha that there had to be more to this. The very fact, the next question we'll talk about, how such a thing happened in the first place. Someone asked the question, how is Yaakov and Leah's marriage valid according to halacha if the kesuba named Rachel and not Leah? So firstly, the fact that there was a Torah before the Torah was officially given, and even though we know even Erev Tavshilin, Avraham Avinu was Mekayim, we don't know. Kesuba definitely comes from Chazal. It's not Midaraisa. So whether actually that Yaakov actually used kesuba or not necessarily. We also know that before Matan Torah, they were also not the Gedder of Bnei Yisrael, as we've discussed a number of times. They followed as much as possible, but a lot of it was more spiritual than physical and halachic. So I don't necessarily say that there was a kesuba in that way. And there's commentaries again discuss Edison and Kedushin and the whole process in context of Yaakov and Laban and Leah and Rachel. But then comes the question, what do we learn from Rachel giving the signs to Leah? Hi, Rabbi Jacobson. I know that this question is from Parshas Vayeitzei. Oh, this question was asked a while ago. Okay. I hope you can address it. How could Rachel betray Yaakov by giving away the agreed upon code? I know you may say that Torah medaberes b'tachtenim u'meramezes b'elyenim. It's actually, that's correct, but it's also more than that. Medaberes b'elyenim u'meramezes b'tachtenim. It's talking about spiritual matters. Estakel baraisa bar alma is a blueprint that precedes Torah kodma le'elam. But it's also giving us the lessons of our actual ancestors and how they led their lives. What lessons should we learn about fidelity to a future spouse from this story? So this all adds to among the many, many questions that we ask about seemingly behavior, either unbecoming or questionable. What is going on? A conspiracy. Mela Laban was a lowlife and a thief and a liar. But why did Rachel go along? So we know because Rachel didn't want to embarrass Leah, so she gave her the signs. But we're talking about here in the Neshamis that Chassidus calls a Mekova. They are high-level souls. Yes, Matan Torah didn't happen, but these were high-level in the Neshamis. There had to be a Leah and Rachel story, just like there had to be a Jacob and Esau story, Hamurim parsha. And it had to come not in a direct way, just like we discussed the deception of Yitzchak, that the brachas of Esau had to come through the garments of Esau. Levushim HaMizbarer. And here too, Levushim HaMizbarer, the levushim of the deceiver called Laban, because you're coming to transform this world, charona, the wrath of God, the alma de shikra. So you have to understand it absolutely medaber as belyenim. Obviously, there are mefarshim that try to understand that api pshat, remez, drush, but the real ultimate explanation has to be that this was all meant to be, and had to come in this deceptive way. Whether Yaakov was conscious or not conscious goes back to the same question we learn about Yehuda and Yosef, for example, that their confrontation was also a deep cosmic confrontation. Was Yehuda Lamata aware? So the Rebbe has a footnote where he says, Avdafki was aware below. But his neshama was aware in some way. And same thing here. What's the reason? So one of the reasons is because Leah represents Bina, and Rachel represents Malchus. Bina is the concealed world of Leah, Malchus is the revealed world of Rachel, and Yaakov Avinu had to have shvatim with both of them. There's the Amshacha of Atzilus. So Yaakov represents Zoh, tiferes specifically, and the yichud of tiferes with Bina, and the yichud of tiferes with Malchus. It's the Kabbalistic terminology. Bottom line is that you had to have two Amshachas here, Alma Diskasi and Alma Disgalia. And Leah is the world of Alma Diskasi, the hidden world. And the truth is, all of us, even when you marry one wife, there's a Rachel within her and there's a Leah within her. And Yaakov needed both Amshachas. Then he also needed Bilhah and Zilpah, the maidservant of Rachel, the maidservant of Leah, respectively. And they gave birth to two more, each one to two more Shvatim. So the structure of Am Yisrael was built by a diverse cosmic and metaphysical forces, all coming together in the tent, in the home of Yaakov, in Charan, to build the power that we have today, the Yidden. This was the building blocks then. Today you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to marry two sisters. Chassidus explains that as well. So you see, it's full of seemingly things that Alpitera are not allowed to marry two sisters, let alone the deception we're talking about. So whether Rachel was conscious of all the cosmic levels, we don't know. But that she knew that she was being led, and this was happening, it wasn't just a matter of ethics of fooling Yaakov. She understood that this was meant to be. So she gave her the signs. At the end of the day, Yaakov also was together with Rachel, married Rachel as well, and she gave birth to Yosef and Binyamin. So without going into all the details here, if you learn the Maimonim Chassidus, which discuss all this, you start seeing why Leah has been mamshich, the Leah Bina, Aim Habonim Smecha gives birth to the six, like Bina gives birth to the Midas. Rachel initially couldn't give birth, and Rachel has her challenges, but she gives birth to Yosef and Binyamin. And then both Leah and Zilpah by mamshich, they're all hamshachas of the world of Atzilus that gives us the strength to do the Aveda we have today. So even though we all come from different Shvatim, but all the Shvatim together is a Kema Acha Shlema, is one large structure. So that leads us, so who were Bilhah and Zilpah? And why are they included with our four matriarchs, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah? Between them, they give birth to 4 of the 12 tribes. So why are they not considered matriarchs? So here again, when you look at the tiferes, for example, so we know there's chesed, gevurah, tiferes. Then there's netzach, chesed, yesod, which correspond to chesed. Chesed and netzach are on the right. Gevurah, chesed, is on the left. And tiferes and yesod is in the center. So Chassidus explains that the 3, Netzach, Chesed, Yesod, are branches of the first 3, Chesed, Gevurah, tiferes. So when we say about the Ovis and Imois, we say there were 3 Ovis, Ein Kein L'Ovis El L'Shleisha, Ein Kein L'Imois El Arba. 3 Ovis and 4 Imois. And explains the Chassidus because the 3 Ovis is the Eidus. Eidus in general, 3 categories, 3 levels. Kalim in general is 4 levels. But in the 4, breaks down further. So Bilhah and Zilpah, that's why they were maidservants. They're an extension of the Imois of Leah, of Rachel and Leah. Again, the details, I suggest looking it up. You can look it up in Sefer Likutim, where it talks about actually Barzel, Rosh Tevis, Bilhah, Rachel, Zilpah, Leah. So they are part of one full, complete picture. You'll also find with the Merkava, sometimes the Daled, the four faces or the four levels of the Merkava, of the chariot, is Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Rachel. Rachel's Malchus. So there's all kinds of different configurations and structures that are all based on the spiritual, mystical, esoteric, and metaphysical structures that are all part of building Am Yisrael. Suffice it to say that. Final question on this parsha: did Bilhah and Zilpah consent to marriage? What's the shaila? So even though they're halachas as servants and so on, besides the menschlichkeit, there's also the Torah part. As someone writes, Shalom Rabbi Jacobson, when I was in synagogue, this question clearly came in previously, I think it was last year, but it's about Vayeitzei. Listening to the Torah portion, a disturbing question came to mind. We don't see that Bilhah and Zilpah ever consented to their relationship with Yaakov. Did the rabbis tell us anywhere that they were asked whether they were willing to be married to Yaakov and that they consented? So first of all, it says in Beferish and Chazal. I think even Rashi alludes to it, and I have to look that up. There's no such thing as imposing. And it was the biggest chus for them. Yaakov. To have children with Yaakov, the Shvatim. It elevated them to go to a higher level. So that's not even a question. Again, it's all part of that bigger plan. With that, even though there's so much more to talk about, let's go over to Parsha Teldes. It's last week's parsha, but there were still some questions that came in. Since it's somewhat of an extension, a continuation to Vayeitzei, let's cover some of that. How do we explain all the allegorical and mystical interpretations in Torah seeming to justify questionable behavior? So I alluded to it a bit before, but I'll read it, even though this is from one of our more irreverent writers, and I recognize the tone, because it's the same little cynical, tongue-in-cheek part. But so be it. I think it's a good question. I will redact it a bit, simply to be appropriate and respectful. But the point is important to have. At what point, well, can we start asking whether the Zohar and Chassidus are not just being apologetic or forcing and making excuses and whitewashing the bad behavior of biblical figures? Like I called it before, questionable behavior. Cases in point. King David violates the story with Bathsheba. Says the Zohar that he was a tzaddik. First of all, the Gemara says anyone that says that David was a sin was just make a mistake. But the Zohar definitely in Kabbalah and Chassidus elaborate. And this was important for him to do because of who would come out of it, to trick the Satan. The different examples, and ultimately be the progenitor of Mashiach will come out of this. If you want to add, you could also add the story of Lot and his two daughters. This you don't need Kabbalah and Zohar or Medrash. Or the story of Yehuda and Tamar. All controversial stories. And without Chazal, you can't always understand it so simply. Especially, Primus HaTorah adds, of course, the bigger picture. So this person is wondering, is this not some type of later interpretations to whitewash or to, God forbid, justify this type of behavior when it seems to be not appropriate behavior? Brings another example, Parsha Teldes, that when Rivka walked that place, a place of Aveda Zara, the fetus of the Esau tries to kick his way out. Chassidus says Esau had a holy soul and wanted to come out not to worship there, but to convert its unholy energy to positive energy. So the writer continues to write. At some point it seems that you could just come up with any type of idea and explain about incidents that happen He gives an example. I could write about an incident in 1989 where I came a few minutes late to shul for mincha one Sunday afternoon because I was playing baseball in the park. But of course, I wasn't doing anything wrong. It looked like I was swinging a baseball bat. I was really sweetening the klippas nega of gevurah, of the source of wood, in Arachampen, and transforming it into atzei shittim to be able to be a vessel to contain the revelation of the Mishkan. So why was I punished by my parents when I really doing a good thing? Okay, you get the gist of it. So it's a very good question, regardless of the irreverence and the joking tone, which I don't always appreciate, but I'm fine. I read it. It's all right. So I'll be very, very honest. When I learned my entire life in yeshiva, and all the stories in Chumash are actually almost every story is controversial. Chetei Tzadas, Kain veHevel, the whole Mabul, what happens afterwards with Noach, Terah Floke, Avram, Leit, Izdaim, Yishmael, Yitzchok, Yaakov and Esau, and the others that I've mentioned. You go on, there's rarely a story that's just smooth. So when you read it the first time, obviously with Kabbalah, Seil, Namuna, it's all Dvar Hashem. But the episodes, it seems very dysfunctional, if I can use that word. And I'm not trying to be irreverent here, I'm just trying to honestly appraise it. And you start saying, so of course you can find a beer, and there's Rashi, and the Ramban, and the Even HaEzer, and all the commentaries, and the Klei Yakar, and the Erechai, and they all get beer. Then you start learning Pshat, and the Drush, Remez, and Sod. All kinds of explanations. We talked last week, Yaakov, Ishtam Yeshiv Aholim, and what's he doing? First he buys the birthright from Esau. Then he conspires with his mother to steal, so to speak, the blessings from Esau. On and on and on and on. So you can find answers for each one of them. Commentaries talk about it, Al Pi Halacha, and Al Pi Nigla, and Al Pi, as I said, the Rush and the Remez. It's ultimately when you come to discover that the Torah is tiferes Hashem, which means it's more than just a narrative and a story. The Zohar says anyone that looks at the Torah as just stories says very sharp words about it. It's also a story. Obviously, these people lived. It's not metaphor. But it doesn't begin with a story in history. It begins with a spiritual story. The Torah is God's mind. A CAT scan of God's mind. When you think of it that way, all these stories, what does it look like in God's mind? It doesn't have the same controversy when you think of it that way. It has deeper meaning. And everything. Even the things that seem so nice, even in Das Tachten, it all starts with a spiritual story, a spiritual blueprint that kod meleila, alpaim shana kod teira leila. It precedes existence. Not only it precedes, it's the blueprint for existence. So when you understand it on that level, all these stories take on a whole different meaning. There's the whole story of transcendence, of getting out of the tzimtzum, of getting out of mitzarim and gvulim. Every character, every personality represents Avram is chesed, Yitzchak is gevurah, and Yaakov is tiferes. So every story, Yaakov and Esau, neshama and guf. Alta Tzemach Tzedek has a whole beer at the beginning of Tanya, like Nefesh Elikis, Nefesh Habamis. Both are created by God. This is not some type of forcing. On the contrary, the actual story is like the end of the narrative. Look in the Pasuk. Yaakov and Esau, why is it a difficult pregnancy? Without commentary. You have two nations inside of you. So why are you seeing that as so forced? Esau is a nation. He represents an archetype. He represents an ideology that's drawn to materialism. Ish Milchama, Yedid Side. In its ultimate evolution, materialism ends up in Avodah Zarah. So therefore his spirit, yes, even in the mother's womb, is gravitating to that. Yaakov gravitates the other direction. And there's a battle, as he explains in Tanya. These are not ideas that came in the 20th century or the 18th or 19th century. This is Torah pre-existence. Then it manifested in a person called Adam and Chava and a Gan Eden, and then all the events that happened afterwards, and a Jacob and Esau, and Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and then all the other stories. Now, who determines that? That's the Torah. That's why Torah b'pirusha nitno. The Torah was given in Har Sinai. The Eibishter explained it with a pirusha and commentary to Moshe. The pshat, the remez, the drush, the sod, the mem tesponim lekan and mem tesponim lekan, all the different methodologies and ways to interpret Torah, including primus ad Torah. So Moshe came down with an understanding of God's perspective on existence. Not only that, a perspective on God himself. Because all these levels are rooted all the way in the Eshes Sfiras, to the Eshes Sfiras Agnuzis, to Machshav Agduma Da'ak, all the way to Bilifiniat Tzimtzum, the Eshes Sfiras Agnuzis, and even higher and higher and higher. This was always known. It was not articulated by everybody. And it's the only way to really understand Torah, to be honest. You take this away, there's so many stories that either are not even relevant technically, Mitzera, Tuma Vatara, Karbonis. You say, Karbonis became, Tfilas became Karbonis Tiknu. So you could say, what, Psakunz? No, because the inyan of a Karban is Tfilas, the inyan of getting close to God. There are different ways. There are times you can do it physically, sometimes it's spiritually. And on and on and on. So when we say that everything's Baruchnius here today, that's not just some type of cute statement. It's telling you that's the etzem of the mitzvahs, the Ruchnius. There are times, Shanim Kittikunam, when you can do it begashmias too. Mashiach comes. We'll be kemitzvahs to the Tzenecha. We'll be able to fulfill it all begashmias again. But it's always Ruchnius is the Iker. It's always bringing down the Kedusha, the Hamshach of Elokus. Anyway, this deserves a lot of discussion, but I think I hopefully did some justice to it. It's not a justification that you can go ahead and do anything and say, oh, you know what, this is some type of ruchnis the Hamshach. Torah gives us guidelines. Certain things are acceptable, things are not. And even, yes, when there's a chet melosh chesed, that also has meaning. So every detail in the Torah is lesson for us in life, because it's part of the blueprint. That's why you have so many things in Torah that are never spelled out. How many years? We only 75 years. We don't know much about Avram Avinu unless we look in Medrash. The Torah chooses what is necessary to be that blueprint for our life. Hayra b'chaim. Okay. Another person asks, what is the difference between the balance of chesed and gevurah and tiferes in context of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? So it says, a deeper explanation of the pasuk that says Avram gave birth to Yitzchak is that since Avram represents chesed, Avram hailed as Yitzchak, and Yitzchak represents gevurah, the Torah is saying true gevurah has to come through and be influenced by chesed. Avram hailed as Yitzchak. That's why we need gevurah shebe chesed and chesed shebe gevurah. So someone asked, my question for Rabbi Jacobson is, what's the difference between gevurah being influenced by chesed and the levels of tiferes, which is harmony of chesed and gevurah? So I discussed it last week. Someone asked a similar question. Maybe it's connected. Is tiferes a sfira of its own, or is it only a convergence or a fusion of chesed and gevurah? A mixture, a composite of chesed and gevurah? The answer is both. Tiferes is one of the spheres. There's 10 spheres. Teisha, there's not 9. If tiferes is just an outgrowth of chesed and gevurah, they only have 9 spheres. Tiferes is a third sphere in the middays, kavam tzoy. Just like Yaakov is not just an outgrowth of Avram Yitzchak, but his father was Yitzchak and his grandfather is Avram. So he also has chesed and gevurah. So Chassidus explains, there's chesed, there's gevurah, there's how they work with each other, and then there's how a new mitzvos comes tiferes. It has also the element of chesed and gevurah. Similar to like we talk about Bein Hashmoshes. There's 3 opinions. Is Bein Hashmoshes, which is twilight, between day and night. Is it half day and half night? Is it a new mitzvos that is called Bein Hashmoshes? Or is it both? And the answer is all the above. Or like a keren zovius, a corner. You don't have a corner unless you have a right angle and left angle, or two angles have to come together. And yet there's a mitzvos to the corner itself. I don't want to go into much detail, but the point being is, tiferes is a sfira b'fnei atzmei that has also an element of chesed and gevurah. So Yitzchak had the chesed of Avram in him. He also balanced out the chesed of Avram, which Ishmael did not have. Same thing with Esau didn't have. There was extreme chesed, the klipa, the lumazeh, and gevurah the lumazeh, or klipa. And Yaakov is a new mitzvos where he brings both of them together. Is there overlap? Of course there's overlap, but tiferes is an inyan la'atzmei. Mavriach min hakotza lakotza. Chesed and gevurah, even when they join, they don't go all the way up to kesed. Not eila ada kesed. Tiferes is eila ada kesed. Okay, Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim. Rachamim is not just a combination of chesed and gevurah. Good. Was there a difference between Jacob and Esau as children and as adults? The person wrote it this way. He writes, since Yaakov and Esau were twins, they would have also had their bar mitzvah on the same day. Yeah, Vayigdol Anorim, it says in the pasuk in Tellus. It's customary for a bar mitzvah boy to give a speech and say a devar Torah. Do we know from Medrash or Chassidus what part of Torah Yaakov and Esau chose to speak about at their bar mitzvahs? Because if we know, we can have a deeper intuition into their personalities and characteristics as they transitioned into adolescence and adulthood. Okay, I don't know if we know what drushes they gave, but we do know that they had two different approaches. And even when Esau came to ask questions to Yitzchak about this, their meiser on salt, etc., and Esau was a learned man, but we still call him Ish Melchama Yeditzayid. He was a warrior, a hunter. Yaakov is Ishtam Yeshav Aholim, the pure one, the innocent one, the complete one, that dwelled in the tents, a scholar. And they looked different, and they had different personalities. Two nations, as we said, within your womb, that will struggle with each other. The nefesh halikis and nefesh habamis. I think that's what we know, and that's what we build upon. We also talked in the parsha tell this, and also parsha Vayeitzei to extent, blessings. What are the dynamics of a blessing? A lot of the discussions around the current parsha is about the blessings given to Esau and Yaakov, but can we take this opportunity to ask Rabbi Jacobson to explain exactly what a blessing is, both in the physical sense and also on a spiritual, metaphysical level? If I turn to the person sitting next to me and I say, I bless you, that you should become wealthy, how does that give the person a better chance of becoming wealthy than if I didn't give a blessing? So bracha comes, Chassidus says, from the word hamshacha, to draw down. And that's what Chassidus distinguishes between a blessing, a bracha, and a tefillah. What means to draw down? It means it's there, but you have to draw it down. So imagine there's we'll call it a package of energy, a gift that's meant to be directed to you, but it's not been delivered to you yet. The bracha will make sure to get rid of the impediments to draw. The channel should open and bring you the blessing. That's why it says that when Yaakov blessed Menashe and Ephraim, so Yosef put Menashe to his right hand, because Menashe was the Bechor, he was older, and Ephraim to the left. What did Yaakov do? He crossed his hands. So the question is asked, why did he cross his hands? He should have simply given Menashe the bracha he deserved, and Ephraim the bracha he deserved, because he knew he could have given Menashe the bracha of the firstborn. Why did he have to give it to Ephraim? Because a bracha you don't create. Ephraim was designated that bracha. What Yaakov was doing was drawing it down to Ephraim. When it comes to tefillah, you can actually change destiny. Say a rotzen chodesh, that even if a person is destined a certain way, you can change that. So it's harder. Tefillah is harder, but it's a bigger chiddush. Bracha is easier, but it's also more guaranteed because you're just revealing that which was there. Bracha v'amshach. So of course that brings to the question of Yaakov and Esau. He was meant to be for Esau. So this already goes into a deeper discussion. Esau and Yaakov were twins, remember. And the Amshacha was meant to really go to both, to Nefesh Halikis and Nefesh Habamis. But the Nefesh Habamis, the goof, doesn't know how to appreciate the firstborn blessing, as well as the blessings of Yitzchak. So what does the Neshev Shalikis do? It has to be the one that's like the caretaker and make sure that the bracha ends up where it belongs. And that's what Rivka understood and Yaakov understood, that the brachas had to go through Yaakov, but the goal was to also be mamshech to Esau. We discussed this more last week, but it's not really directly negated. You want to know what a blessing is, that's the dynamics of a bracha. And finally, why did Yitzchak bless Yaakov with the name Elokim and not Havaya? V'yitn l'cha Elokim. If the name Havaya is associated with revelation and kindness and giving, and the name Elokim is associated with judgment, concealment, and withholding, why did Yitzchak bless Yaakov with his name Elokim? And why does Chassidus say that by doing so he was giving an even deeper level of blessing than if he invoked the name Havaya? Because Elokim is takadin and simtsum. But the koyach ha-simtsum is rooted the helam ha'atzmi that's even higher than koyach ha-gilui. It's harder to conceal than to reveal. You look at a chacham, a wise person. If he has something to say, it's easy for him to say it. To restrain himself is harder. Mila b'sela shtika b'terei. To speak is a sela. Silence requires more effort. In one of the interpretations in that. So Elokim is taka a more hidden level, but when you can reveal the power that lies in that gevurah and that din, tagbeirus achayis, that intensity, that's what Yitzchak wanted to accomplish. That even Elokim, not just Havaya where there's gili, can reveal something that's even higher than Havaya. And that's why the psukim that talk about Havaya li'il l'chol Elokim, in this week's parsha too. That's the bottom line part in that meaning. Being that next Shabbos is Tes Kislev, let's say a few words about Tes Kislev. What do we learn from this day? So the Rebbe would always emphasize, Mitteler Rebbe is binah, the hanor, the expansiveness of taking the nekudis, the concentrated points that the Alter Rebbe taught in Chassidus, and expanding on it. So you futza meinesecha chutza, to spread them. Meinesecha is taka chachmeh, but to spread them is binah. And that's what the Mitteler Rebbe did from the beginning of his Nesius, right away publishing and doing whatever possible, the spreading of Chassidus. Tzemach Tzedek said, if you cut my father-in-law, it was also his uncle, the Mitteler Rebbe, blood wouldn't come from his veins, it would be Chassidus. A pashtus of Chassidus. Basically a deluge in a positive way. Molad is Deus Hashem. So the lesson to us is that's how we have to learn and teach Chassidus in a harchavidik way. Obviously aligned with the integrity of the Nekudas HaChachma of the Alter Rebbe. What are some interesting teachings of the Mitteler Rebbe? In honor of Tes Kislev, can we ask Rabbi Jacobson to discuss a few interesting teachings of the Mitteler Rebbe? Thank you. It comes to mind one that the Rebbe very often would quote from Sharei Yichud, that his bonus has to not just be in general, but in detail. God is in the details. In a way, it's an extension of Bina. Bina is the details. You break it down to details. You see, very often you get stuck in platitudes, you get stuck in general terms. Real success is when it comes down into the nitty-gritty, into the very details. One Nakudah. Another that often is cited is that the Mitteler Rebbe, one of his chidushim, obviously based on the Alter Rebbe, is that Tachlis HaPshit is connected to Tachlis HaYischalkus. Again, probably connected to this idea. You think we go higher up, it gets one more to a singularity. But wherever there's total pshittus, total seamlessness, will also create total distinction. So the diversity, the multitudes of diversity in existence, comes from the pshittus of the highest levels. Sometimes you think it comes from tzimtzum. You break it down, so it goes into many details. That details, ultimately, infinite details come from infinite singularity. Recently, as I was teaching Ayin Beis, so I was learning the Maimer Mika Hashem Elokeinu, a Chanukah Maimer from the Alter Rebbe. And the Mitteler Rebbe has 75-page Maimer on that, 74-page. So there are chidushim upon chidushim in the inyan of Helam Ha'atzmi. A lot of Ayin Beis is built on it. The depth speaks very often about reaching levels that are beyond paradox. You don't find it so much in the Alter Rebbe, at least not extensive. The idea that there's the darga of reaching gvul, and then reaching bli gvul, keli and eir, and then a level that's neither keli nor eir. Yet another one of the Mitteler Rebbe, you see it quite often in his writings. And there's more. I'll suffice with that. Obviously, coming Tes Kislev, be a good idea to learn something from the Mitteler Rebbe. Especially these weeks, Teres Chaim is very geschmacke, very geschmacke Maimorim, parsha Vayeitzei, since Vayeitzei is Tes Kislev. And Yud Kislev the next day is the geulah of the Mitteler Rebbe. Tes Kislev, remember, is also his birthday and his yahrzeit. So Mamalit Tzadikim, Miyem Liyem, you see by the Mitteler Rebbe, the complete cycle. He was born. And his Hilul Istalkus is on the same day. The Rebbe talks about that as well. I'm going to conclude with something that's a little painful topic, but nevertheless a very critical one. And the question is this: to what extent are people facing mental health struggles or addictions responsible for their Torah obligations? And here's how the person writes it out. Are people who have bipolar disorder, depression, and similar mental illnesses held accountable for violating parts of the Torah? I have such disorders. Sometimes a manic episode will last a few days, sometimes a few weeks, until things straighten themselves out. During a depressive episode, sometimes I do things I wouldn't normally do when I'm feeling well. I'm not fully in control of myself when I do it. Sometimes I'll go on the train on Shabbos. Sometimes I'll sit in a corner for a few hours and say not nice things about God. I'm not doing this on purpose. It's just impulsive. When I don't feel well mentally, I try to do things to make me feel better, even if it means going to a concert on a day when I shouldn't be going. After a manic episode, I feel remorse that I did things not in alignment with the Torah rules, but I hope Hashem will forgive me and not have a grudge against me because I'm not doing it on purpose. It's because of my illness. Okay. It's always sad to read. Of course, I deal with many people and hear often situations like this. So let's keep one thing in mind. I think we all have to make sure to know. There's no room for judgmentalism here. Al todnas chavere. We just don't judge. You should know that. There are people who sometimes do things, it may seem to you completely off. You judge them. Who this and that. And start giving explanations. People are suffering in many different ways. And Torah speaks about it. There's a thing called mezid, intentional, deliberate. There's shegig, by accident. And there's einus. Einus means it's not an accident. Einus means you're compelled. Something forced you to do it. There are people, God forbid, that not just a matter of regular mental illness, are situations where they're completely not in control of their behavior. Who made it that way? Hashem. So it's between them and Hashem. And einus rachmana patra. So obviously, none of us are experts in this area. You could say, are we sure it's an einus? Is it really? Maybe the person did have control. Just because you get angry, or just because you're depressed or upset, can you break a law? It depends. Some people do not have full control, unfortunately. Not because they don't want to. It's actually quite humiliating to know you can't control certain things. So I think we need to understand that. I'm not saying it I'm saying it firstly to all of us when we see certain things. But especially to the writer here. So my answer to you is, don't be hard on yourself. Find a trusted mashpia who understands both mental illness, your situation, and you can talk it through. And there'll be times, yes, einus, but doesn't mean you have to kill yourself with guilt or beat yourself up. The Eibishter versteht sehr gut, better than all of us. The Eibishter knows what's going on in the heart of a person. And that's the only one you have to care about. Now, do we do sometimes things we did have control and then made a mistake? That also happens. We're all human beings. But the goal is not to beat yourself up. In Perek of Tes and Tanya, which I'm actually teaching nowadays, he doesn't talk about beating yourself up. He's talking about on the contrary, coming from strength to recognize how much materialism affects us and sometimes pollutes us. Not to belittle and humiliate yourself, just to break the resistance that comes, like he says there, the wood won't catch fire. But I don't want to talk about that right now. In this case, we're talking about true awareness, true introspection, and being honest with yourself. And I'm very glad you wrote this question, not just for you, but all those that are listening. Some people are afraid to ask such questions because they think they'll be judged. They'll think that they're doing something wrong. So that's the approach to take to something of this nature. And Hashem will understand, and we always try to grow, and none of us are perfect, and people who don't suffer from these things, unfortunately, have their own challenges, and we all have to deal with what we have to deal with. And finally, a similar question, since we're already on the topic. If someone is suffering from an addiction, do we tell them to just continue doing mitzvos and ignore the addiction? So I mentioned addiction too, because addiction too can come to a point. I mentioned anus. There's also the concept of nichnas bei ruach shtus, but that was not an excuse, because every aveda is due to ruach shtus. But sometimes a person goes into the category of a sheita. Cheder sheita v'kotten is part of min mitzvos. So this too, again, is case by case. None of us can make that decision, especially not about ourselves. So is an addiction to the point, like if someone writes the example of a sexual addiction that is out of control, can we tell them just to focus on doing Torah, mitzvos, mitzvos, and not focus on their disgusting addiction, or they first need to focus on getting rid of their addiction? It's a case by case question. There's no question and no doubt that you have to always try to bring light into your life. Part of healing, including healing from negative things and addictions, is also ma'at decha har becheshach. So to stop doing mitzvahs and stop doing Torah because I'm an addiction is not you do whatever you can do because it gives you koyach. But to be realistic, you don't want to be a tevel v'sheretz biyadeh, a person going into a mikveh, doing the mitzvah, but he has a sheretz in his hand. A dead animal, or a tomedik animal. The nevela is a sheretz. So you want to make sure you're not being a hypocrite. So while you're also part of, do the mitzvah, and then do what you have to do to clean up your act. And if you can't control yourself, go for help. You always can go for help. There's no excuse. So part of bringing godliness into your life is cleaning up the addiction. So it's not either or. It's not saying, I'm only going to clean up the addiction, I'll ignore all mitzvahs now. Why? If you can do the mitzvahs. Now, if a mitzvah gets in the way, meaning right now for healing, we're not talking about a case where for healing purposes right now you have to do something on Shabbos, let's say a medical intervention, etc. That's life and death. So even though I don't like to end on this note because Mesayim and B'tev, but the goal here is always to bring Kedusha into our lives. We're coming into the month of Kislev, the end of the month. Timu kol shmanim shebehechel. All the oil was contaminated, polluted, like addictions, psychologically speaking. And still we find the pach echad sheman. One crucible, one flask of oil that's pure. Because there's always purity. If you're driven and you want, you can find the purity. The problem is when we don't fight, when we give in, resign ourselves. Oh, I'm addicted. That's not my objective here. When I say not judgmental, doesn't mean an excuse. I can do whatever I want. I'm addicted or I have mental illness. It's just a full approach. But you want to become accountable as much as you can. That's called part of healing. And when Torah also wants us to heal. That's also part of serving Hashem. It's also maybe the biggest mitzvah of all. Because when you're not healthy, God forbid, you can't tada mevil de kedusha. Purity brings to holiness. So may it be a leba dika chedesh Kislev, a geulah dika chedesh Kislev. Everybody should be redeemed from all their different challenges and all the different dislocations and displacements and dissonances and disparities. And we should experience real geulah and real light. It should be a redemptive month, a month of simcha and joy. This has been MyLife Chassidus Applied. We're here every Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. Everyone have a gebenchte Chedesh and a gebenchte Yar.
This program is brought to you by MyLife Chassidus Applied. Please help us continue our programs. Make even a small contribution at chassidusapply.com/donate.